You're listening to Cybersecurity and Compliance with Craig Petronella. Visit us online at petronellatech.com.
There was actually just recently a Health and Human Services response to current litigation regarding access to medical records and the portability of private information. So I can kind of give you some high points of that as well.
Yeah, please.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it basically, I think in my practice, what a lot of times the challenge is getting medical records, because when a attorney's office requests medical records, the first thing a hospital and medical provider does is they kind of push the priority of those down to the bottom, because it's something that they want to make sure it goes through compliance in terms of are they possibly at risk for being sued, and are there other issues? And then it's like, once they get the okay to get them to release the medical records, then as a third party requesting those records, even with patient authorization, we're charged in like huge fees per page costs, copying costs. And there's been some litigation and there's been regulations put in place, but it's still something that we have to push back at quite frequently. And a lot of times the urgency of getting those records, we end up just paying to get those records because we've got to have that evidence to push the case forward. But recently there was a Chart Squad is a group I've been using that basically functions as a patient advocate. And the patient authorizes them to pursue requests. And if Chart Squad gets a response saying you need to pay us a prepayment of this amount, then Chart Squad will function as their advocate to file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights and pursue their rights to be able to get the medical records in as cheap a manner as possible. And so the recent decision that came down last week is that response times on those requests by patient advocate groups, they have to respond within 15 days as opposed to 30. And there's no fees associated with complying with those requests, because it's essentially a third party functioning as a patient advocate to request those records directly on behalf of the patient.
Have you ever heard of Health ID passport technology built on blockchain?
I have not.
So this is going to make your world so much better.
Let's hear it.
So Health ID passport technology is an initiative, a project that multiple companies are trying to create. And basically what it is storing our patient health information, personal identifiable information on a blockchain that the user or consumer controls. So in the future, and I've talked about this years ago, I think it was actually 3 or 4 years ago now. So I haven't really followed the path of how it's progressed. But basically the vision of it is one day you and I will be able to have access at our fingertips to all of our information and get to choose who and when we share that information. So it no longer is in the hands of the doctor, the hospital, or the different place, the medical practices that you go to. It's in your hands and in my hands. So I get to choose, okay, if I'm working with Sean today and he needs to see some of my PHI, I'm going to give him access, and I'm going to give him access to this, this, and that. I get to pick and choose what he has access to, when, how often, and if it expires. But I, as the human controller of it, I need no third-party involvement, and it's all secure, and it's all built on blockchain technology.
That would make my world a lot easier. That would make a patient's world a lot easier.
Yeah.
Because the challenge a lot of times, especially with cases that I work on, had a call with someone just last Friday where he had what he believed to be negligent medical treatment with a foot surgery. And he, in his recovery, developed a blood clot, and he's still having continuous issues in making a full recovery. And he's concerned, not so much as far as litigation goes, but he's concerned about getting a second opinion and trying to figure out what it's going to take to make him better, or at least will he be able to make a full improvement. And the pushback he's getting from just going to request his records from the prior care provider to get a second opinion he's having tremendous difficulty in
But
doing that.
isn't that crazy? I mean,
it is.
that's so inefficient. And like you had mentioned, the chart company and these other third parties, all that goes away with a blockchain solution. I mean, it's me, my data. I get to pick and choose, and I don't have to worry about if the hospital security is lax, and all these companies are getting breached left and right. There's another one just last week with FireEye, and now they're saying this morning in the paper and the news, that the Russians have stolen more intellectual property around and more CUI or controlled unclassified information in the defense supply chain, and it never ends, right? So my point is that in this context, if you and I get to control our PHI and our data, it could be, we get to choose who and when we share that information, and it's all secured. All blocks of it are on the blockchain. I mean, that's the way of the future for sure.
Yeah, I think you'd have obviously some learning curve, I think, with people that aren't as technologically savvy. Because I mean, I think people like you and I in industries like you and I, we have to evolve. We have to be able to utilize technology, and we sometimes take for granted how adept we are at utilizing technology and what's to come. And the hard part is, I think there's a lot of segments of society that may not have those resources, or may not have the savvy to understand what's theirs and how to hold on to it, or what portals to access. And so that's going to be something that's going to take place, obviously, over time.
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely valid and true. But that also opens the competitive landscape for companies to come out with more user-friendly services that access and control that data, right? So the first step is, let's store our data in blocks that are protected by blockchain technology, right? And then the next step is, new application developers will develop front ends to access that data with your permission, of course. And then you can have, trainings around that, and maybe Apple, I know Amazon is also deep in healthcare now. Maybe by that time, those big companies, those big players will create some front ends that are easy to use. But yeah, with any technology, there's always the learning curve and the human aspect, of course. However, most folks, I think, are probably used to using some type of portal electronic medical record system with a hospital anyway. So, a lot of that is, I think this is going to be a huge disruptor for a lot of industries, and with elimination of a lot of third party hands in the pie, so to speak.
Oh yeah, it's something that has to happen, I think, especially when it's a. I mean, I rely on medical records in order to build my client's case, and the pushback I get in being able to access this information that is my client's information. It takes up a lot of time and takes up a lot of resources.
Well, yeah, so that's just so woefully inefficient from time and cost. I mean, when you were saying about copy cost and, basically arcane methodology around, processing information, all of that goes away. You would be able to scale more. You'd be able to help the clients that you're serving faster, cheaper, ultimately. There's going to be big disruption. There's going to be a lot of those middle players that just go out of business if they don't retool. But it's just like how blockchain has been used by Walmart. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Walmart was one of the first commercial recognized use cases around blockchain technology and using it in the tracking of supply chain around produce. So if there's an E. coli outbreak, for example, Walmart's technology with the blockchain solution can find where did that, if it was E. coli in lettuce or kale or something, where was the origin of that? Who was the farmer? Where did it come from? And in seconds, they can pull all that factual information off the blockchain. So it's again, it's efficiency and saves a lot of, there's no third party needed. So the same thing's happening in transformation around real estate and deeds and storing, records like that on a blockchain. Years ago when I bought a house, you had to pay for title insurance, so basically you're paying a third party to validate, a certain aspect of the transaction. So all that would go away with blockchain technology. So I think that blockchain will be, a big player in securing personal identifiable information and making things much more efficient for folks like you that need to access this information.
Oh, it'd be great.
Yeah. So
I'll
now that we talked about that, I'll do some more research in there and see what progressions have been made there. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that day. I'm tired of my information being, if you go to the 5 different doctors, now my PHI is in 5 different systems, and I got to trust that 5 different systems and entities are going to keep my information secure. And I know, because this is my specialty, 9 out of 10 of them are not going to do a good job with that.
Right.
So then who's paying the price? Ultimately, it's me. My information is going to be out there, numerous times.
Yeah.
So,
how tech is evolving or kind of just changing, and you're constantly having to evaluate and process the potential for risks of breaches and those types of things, and it couldn't be more scary than what happened with the Russian hack over the weekend of the Treasury Department. It's like, what are we doing? Parts of government that are supposed to be secure and protected, and we're still getting hacked by people that we know have hacked us before. So what are we doing?
Yeah, it's craziness. And it goes around, the new cybersecurity maturity model certification, the CMMC process that I've been specializing in ever since its inception. It goes around that, DOD, Department of Defense, has seen that we've had these problems for years now. They made great strides in releasing the CMMC. I'm a big fan of it. I think it's fantastic. However, our own government sectors and departments are not even taking this seriously enough, or they're doing the third-party audits of themselves, and the cross-checking and cross-balancing is not happening. If it was, then this wouldn't be the daily news headline.
Right. It's nuts.
So, it's just, again, crazy times, but more need for policies, procedures, security controls, third-party audits, and help for these folks, not just for the government areas, but for the players in the supply chain that are, so it's in best interest for our country, for everyone to really take cyber and compliance more seriously and really buckle down. But, moving along to your specialty, how about you introduce yourself to my audience, and, we can talk about some areas that, some things at a deeper level of what you're working on.
Yeah, sure. Craig, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it. My name again, I'm Sean Park. I'm with the Park Law Firm. I'm a small personal injury firm that is based in Chicago, but also have an office in Atlanta. I'm also licensed to practice in the states of Tennessee and Florida, but my practice focus areas are primarily in the areas of personal injury, catastrophic injury, wrongful death, some medical malpractice in the Chicago and Atlanta markets.
Awesome. Well, welcome, and thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. So, obviously you have talked about earlier on the show the challenges of patient health information and working with hospitals and various medical practices. Obviously, with blockchain, that should get smoother, and we hope that could be a viable solution, and I'll definitely look into that further for you. But at the current landscape, how do you feel that it's obviously inefficient, but what's the average time span? So if you're working with a client and you need to get medical records from a hospital, is it a week? Is it 2 weeks? Is it a month? Like, what does that look like?
I would say on an expedited process, and there's always a fee for everything when a third party is requesting records. And so depending upon the needs of the client and the need to be able to have that information to be able to push the case forward, I sometimes have to pay a premium to expedite a records request. And if I do that, I can get records within 2 to 3 weeks. But in normal times, if I'm just making a basic request, the records will be sent to me probably within 30 to 45 days. That's if the request goes through and meets all of the screening standards that the health records maintainer or the business office makes sure that it's okay and they authorize the records to be released. But there's a lot of inefficiencies, both from a personal standpoint as well as from a support staff standpoint, of having to follow up on records requests. and figure out where they are, because ultimately those records requests are being received and processed by humans. And they're going through their chain of command. And a lot of times, unless you don't have every I dotted or T crossed, they're going to kick it back and you've got to start from scratch. Or the records request could be received and somehow it gets to the bottom of the stack and someone misses it. And as a law firm that deals with a select number of cases and the need for the information to be brought in efficiently, I don't have the time to continue to stay on top of getting those records. It's something that I kind of will process and check off like on a weekly to-do list, or every couple of weeks, kind of follow up on those things. So the follow-up and the man hours associated with following up on those records is quite tedious, and it's a loss of productivity. And so what I've used recently, and probably the last 5 or 10 cases that I've got, is a company called Chart Squad. And they are a third-party private health information application that functions as a patient advocate to request those records. And I pay a fee per request to medical providers. They will make that request to the medical facility. They will also do additional searches for billing, because a lot of times what happens when you have a hospital bill, what most people don't realize is that the physicians are separately employed from the hospital for liability purposes. So they not only will you get a hospital bill for the hospital services, emergency room services, operating room services, if you stay overnight, room and board type services and fees, but then you're going to get charged a bill for the physician's professional services that took place within that hospital. Then you'll have sometimes even separate bills for radiology that will come in. So a lot of times patients, it's all they can do to deal with making that physical recovery. They can't keep track of all the records that come in or all the bills that come in. They're like, well, I went to the hospital, I should only have one bill, but that's not how it works, because there's multiple departments that will give separate bills. So basically, I just tell the client to send me whatever bills they've got, and I'll target my requests in that fashion. And Chart Squad's been a big help, because literally I'll just plug in the patient information. Chart Squad will reach out to the patient to get their authorization to function as their patient advocate, and they will push the requests, and they'll continue to follow up on the requests. What's been happening lately with medical records departments is just say, oh, well, this is a request. You need to pay a prepayment of this amount of money. And that's outside the current litigation. That's outside the law with regard to the current litigation that's going on, the current regulations that are regulating how this information should be disclosed and what fees, if any, should be charged. And so in those cases, Chart Squad will reach back out to me and say, this facility is charging or seeking to charge a fee. If you want to pursue these records on an expedited basis, we would recommend you go ahead and pay this fee, and the records will be released immediately. So, however, in most circumstances, sorry, I'll cut it short. In most circumstances, there's not a huge rush for me to have those records, and I would much rather save my client the money on the back end, because any money that I pay and when I get a recovery, it's going to be an expense on their settlement statement that they're going to have to pay back to me. So I want to be as efficient as possible. And so I'll just pursue a civil rights violation claim that Chart Squad advocates for the patient through that vehicle. And I've had great success in having those fees or those prepayments set aside, and Chart Squad then gets the records for me.
Okay, well, that sounds like a good service and help for you at this time. But I guess my question that comes to mind is, why wouldn't the patient just go direct to help you get the records?
Because it's, like I said, I deal with catastrophic or serious injury type claims. And so the patients, the legwork that the patient would have to do to get those records, I try to make my service for my clients as turnkey as possible. When they hire me, I want to take the legal side of their burden off their shoulders. I want them to focus on physical recovery, mental and emotional recovery, being able to get back to work, being able to get out of bed without being in pain, making all their physical therapy appointments, making all their follow-up medical appointments. I don't want them going on a goose chase to go and get the records. It would be easy if they could do that, but the complications for patients to have to deal with that a lot of times is very difficult.
Got it.
And a lot of times medical records providers, even when a patient will call and say, please release these records to my lawyer, they'll view it as, oh, it's a third party request, so we can charge all these fees and send the records on directly to the attorney.
So
that's what's happened in my experience, at least.
Okay. So is that similar to like a power of attorney type paperwork that's happening?
Yeah. When prior to recently, patients would sign on my firm's letterhead a HIPAA authorization,
right,
which would allow, and I would plug in the blanks for all the information I would request. I would set up the dates of the information I'm seeking. I would want all records, radiology, any type of images, all reports, all nurses' notes, basically anything that's pertaining to this patient with this social security number, this date of birth, for these dates of treatment, I want you to send that to me. And the patient signs it, and those HIPAA authorizations, once they're dated, they're only good for a certain number of times. So what I do is I tell my patients to sign them, but my clients to sign them, but don't date them, so that I can date them on the date of the request. So when invariably I have to request follow-up records because the patient's continuing to treat, I can then contact that office again and say, please provide me with these updated records. Patient was seen on these subsequent dates after my last request, and they'll usually do that. But then there's a lot of follow-up with that, and a lot of man hours associated with following up on those requests for supplemental records.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It just seems like just a convoluted process for you to go through.
It takes a lot. I mean, and I think it's just, I mean, that's just the nature of my practice. It takes a lot of time to get that information and evidence, and it's difficult because you get so much pushback and you get so many fees associated with just providing the patient's information to me. And the thing that's also kind of difficult that I've just recently thought about is that, I mean, ultimately, all of my clients are people that have been hurt through no fault of their own. Right. I mean, there might be some arguable issues of potential liability, assumption of risk, or those types of things, but most of these people are injured in situations where they didn't cause their harm. Someone else did. And ultimately, their pursuit of recovery or accountability or justice for their injuries and losses is being reduced by the people that are providing their medical care, because they're going to have to pay back the money to me so I can obtain their medical information. Yeah. So it further injures them because they're not getting full maximum value for their case because of the other monies that have to be paid out in the process of pursuing their claim.
Yeah, that's just crazy.
It is. I think there are ways that it can get better, and I think the use of technology is surely going to get better. And it's a matter of a lot of times just making sure that the patient knows their rights and the patient knows that it's their personal health information that they should be able to take wherever they go, and it shouldn't be difficult to access, and it should be as easy as sending an electronic request with authorization showing certain identifying information that you are in fact the person authorized to make that request, so you can get your records. And use them for whatever purpose you need to use them for.
Yeah, that's why I'm a big fan of the Health ID passport technology on blockchain. I think that that's going to be huge, and just revolutionize this whole concept around all these third parties involved. And the expenses, I think it's going to make it more efficient in time and cost.
I would love to be at the front of the news as soon as you learn anything more about that. I would love to know about that.
Absolutely.
I would love to be able to incorporate that into my practice and provide that service to my clients to be able to get that information, because I think it would make their lives a lot easier and make my life a lot easier.
Oh, I think it'll be revolutionary. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'll definitely keep you posted on that. What is your opinion on the current landscape around HIPAA right now? I'm sure that, from my perspective, the law was enacted in 1996. It's old, it's antiquated. I think the new CMMC is going to overtake HIPAA and spread into other industries, and especially regulated areas because it's just the most modern approach to things. I like the methodology around the checks and balance, where you have to basically prove and show supporting evidence that you're doing all this stuff. And then you have to have a third party, a certified third party, come in and audit you on premise, look over your shoulder, look through your stuff. So I think it's going to be huge in that respect. But what's your opinion around it?
Yeah, I think anything you can improve upon with HIPAA is going to be welcomed, just because of what we've seen how HIPAA was enacted and how it's kind of played out in practice. And the challenge, I think, with getting someone up to speed with new legislation is the fact that we've been playing in this space for 25 years at this point with HIPAA, and it's hard to change. I mean, areas of the law, even once you enact new legislation, it's hard to get people that are accustomed to playing in a prior format. Even if they were doing it incorrectly, it's hard to get them to evolve and do it. But everyone, I think everything that we've kind of seen, just it's basic human nature to kind of be like, oh, well, this is what we're accustomed to. This is how it's always been done. And then figuring out how to change it, how to improve it to make sure that we are allowing patients the free access of their information, and we're allowing them to take it wherever it needs to be taken, or use it in whatever means it needs to be utilized for whatever purposes. And for my specific purpose, to be able to access the information a lot easier from a patient standpoint, it would reduce their expenses on my side of things, because they could easily just say, here's my information, here's the information you've got to input into my portal in order to access its information. And then I could present their case a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. It's just going to be something that I think is going to be challenging for people just because it's something new. And then there's always, you're relying on government to roll things out responsibly and be able to properly inform people. And I don't think that happens very frequently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most powerful process that could change in the future is the requirement of medical practices to go through that audit process. Because right now it's pretty much self-attestation until something goes wrong, right? And then you have the forensics, and then you have to show all your supplying evidence that you're HIPAA compliant. But most of the folks that I talk to, especially new startup medical practices or doctors, they tell me all the time, I've gone to years and years of schooling, and you've told me all this information that's completely foreign to me. I've never heard of any of this information. They oftentimes have a binder for their HIPAA compliance, but the binder is no substitute for all the policies and procedures that they're supposed to have. And then they don't understand how those policies and procedures have to map to what's called security controls and the layers, and how there's all this work that has to be done on a continuous ongoing basis. So right now, like I said, it's very honor system, I think. And, hackers know this, and that's why hospitals and medical practices are still low-hanging fruit for most of these, because they're running these programs, they're scanning your networks, they're checking on things, they're jiggling the door handles. And most medical practices don't even have the technology to detect those activities, much less mitigate the risks, So oftentimes I've seen it, there's a breach that occurs, hackers are in their system. The latest that's pretty common way is they get into their mail system, their Office 365 system, and they sit there and they just lurk and just kind of wait, and they're just covering their tracks. And it's a crazy landscape that we live in. But the fact of the matter is that, I think that most hackers are smart and lazy. They're constantly running these scans and checks to basically for those applications to come back to them and show them a list of here's your prime targets, right? And hospitals and medical practices are notoriously running older operating systems and older IT equipment because they have to support legacy digital X-ray systems or something, because they don't want to buy the latest and greatest. It needs to use an older operating system. So then they have more challenges on how to properly secure those devices.
Yeah, and the thing with hackers is they're incredibly smart, like you said, and they only need one breach So they can write code that could send out thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pings to a system. And they only need one to come back to give them that access point. And that's something that, I think every industry, every professional industry has that same kind of complaint about, well, I went to med school for this reason. I went to law school for this reason. I didn't anticipate having to figure out how secure my medical records network needs to be for a small solo practice. But it's something that when you're trading or you're working in protected private health information of your patients, it's something you have to be at the forefront on to make sure that information is protected. Similarly, a lot of stuff going on the legal side of things, especially with e-filing of documents. Every time I file a pleading in court, I have to attest that I have done proper redactions to make sure there's no private information that's being contained on this document. So courts are in tune with it. I don't know if they're completely up to speed on all of it, but at least they're putting the burden on anyone that's submitting a pleading to that large court system portal to make sure proper redactions are done so that there's no personally identifying and compromising private information that could allow a hacker to infiltrate and use that information to commit further fraud.
Yeah, and I think that hackers also know how most mid to larger size medical practices, there's so many human element targets, around social engineering and phishing and business email compromise. Larger the organization, it just takes, like you said, it takes one to give up the credentials to something. Vendor impersonations. It doesn't take a lot of effort for a hacker to do some basic recon to figure out who their vendors are for a particular hospital and, create a very targeted phishing email called whaling to the C-levels. But yeah, it's just, like I said, a crazy world that we live in. I was just curious if you feel like there will be, do you agree that you think that there will be more pressure around audits in regards to making sure proactively that the medical practices are in compliance? Do you feel like there might be an increase in any of those activities?
Yeah, I think so. Just because, like you said, the risk of hacking and the risk of breaches is growing greater, and there's so much of a human element to it. I think part of it, it's kind of a two-pronged approach. If you have to have proper training of your staff that deals with private health information, and you need to have systems in place to make sure that your system, your network, as secure as it possibly can be. But then you have to come in, and I think that's where a company such as yourself would come in with training processes to make sure that your employees are not hacking, or your employees are not, you're not falling for those phishing scams. You're checking the email addresses and making sure they're valid with the person that's sending, that is purporting to send you that message. And everyone can fall victim to phishing scams, and everyone can, and it's just a matter of sometimes it's just inadvertently clicking on a link. Yeah. And everything right now is so, if you saw it with the election, everything is so automated that it used to be just robocalls, and now it's these text messages, and you get text messages from anywhere, and it'll say, click here to show your support. It's like, I don't want to click on anything because I don't know where this is coming from. Yeah. And it's gotten so more, a lot of times the biggest scams that have been going on are just people, you always hear of the ones that, like, people with the phone call and say, there's a warrant out for your arrest, please call this number immediately. So, and then you call that number, and a lot of people fall for it because the fear of the authorities coming to get them is something that's going to, like, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and pay this, but it's essentially extortion. Mm-hmm. And people just need to have, especially now, need to have their radar up with any electronic messages they receive or anything they receive via telephone or text message.
Yeah, all good points. And, the human element is always the weakest in anything, right? So, security awareness training, so important now more than ever, but not just the training, but actually the completion of the training and the testing, the quizzing, the constant auditing of that process, and showing the chain of evidence trail for each of your employees to make sure that, hey, maybe Susie Brown in the corner is not paying attention enough to the latest email security threats and needs to go back to look over some training and get retested because she's currently posing some risks to your organization.
Right.
So I think that training and going through the drills for all of this is super important. So not just saying that you're going to do certain things or getting the policies and procedures in order, but actually having a professional set of eyes to look over them and make sure that everything's mapped properly, and going through that battleship scenario.
You've got to have the audits.
Yeah,
you have to have the auditing.
But a lot of people, they're not doing the security risk assessments. They're not doing the pen testing. And they're, you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you don't do this stuff, you don't know where your gaps are, and you don't know where to start and where to fix things. So I think that it's particularly challenging for the smaller organizations that don't have a compliance person and don't even know where to start, So, yeah, like I said, I keep going back to CMMC, but I think that CMMC is going to be a good thing, because I hope that one day the CMMC overtakes HIPAA and requires medical practices to show the supporting evidence for all this. Otherwise, they shouldn't be able to practice. I feel like that might sound harsh and people might get upset with me for saying that, but here's the reality of the situation. If you really put a cap on that and make it so that practices can't be using our information and maybe sharing it inappropriately and risking all of us, why not what's the harm in having a certified third-party auditor assess your practice to make sure that you're doing everything right? Not to get you in trouble, but to proactively, at a much fractional level, as far as cheaper, get this stuff in order now rather than later, because it's just a matter of time. Because most of the medical practices, if you suffer a breach, you're going to go out of business. So why not do this ahead of time anyway? And the number one complaint I hear about it is it's too complicated. They don't know where to start, and it's too expensive.
Well, the physician's Hippocratic oath is to first do no harm, and that by extension should apply to their practices as well, because while they may be providing top-notch care and physically healing or treating a patient, their mismanagement of that patient's data or information could cause that patient harm.
Yep.
So, they need to, it's one of those things that, in plaintiff's attorney circles, there's always talk about litigation reform and tort reform. And a big part of that is regulation or restrictions upon the ability to bring medical malpractice cases. And the biggest thing that you hear quite frequently from the hospitals and physicians side of things is, well, malpractice insurance is too expensive. You're going to drive, there's a healthcare crisis. You're going to drive good doctors out of the state because it's going to be too expensive for them to practice, or too expensive for them to have medical malpractice coverage or insurance coverage. But that we're all human. Doctors are human. Right. We all make mistakes. But if you are in a practice where you're providing medicine and treatment to somebody, part of that whole practice also has to be to treat the person as well as their information as confidentially as you would if you were just treating that person individually. You're not going to have a whole gallery of people watching how you're treating that person. It's private information exchange between the patient and his or her doctor. But at the same time, you need to make sure that information that you gather during the time that you're treating them, and you're storing that information for future purposes, for record keeping purposes, for future visits, for continuity of care, for transferring that information to a subsequent treating provider for that particular patient. You've got to make sure that stuff's secure. Absolutely.
Now, are there any tips or anything that you could think of that would help folks? Like, one thing that came to mind when you were just talking about that is, most people should have a will, right? and
Yes.
document that process. But maybe there's some things that they should do to proactively prepare that, God forbid, something happens and they get into an accident. Maybe it would make it easier, more efficient for you or somebody like you to help them, right? So is there anything any tips or suggestions that you have around that?
Absolutely. The thing that I see quite frequently is when someone gets into a car accident, because that's usually where most personal injuries occur. I mean, there are more isolated incidents where people are seeking compensation for an injury or loss. But for the most part, the cases I run across are people that are hit by a car, hit by a truck, in a car accident, those types of wrecks. And the sooner you can talk with an attorney, the better off you are. Because when those types of things happen and you're in the ambulance going to the hospital, the underside, the seedy underbelly of the personal injury world is a practice called runners. And runners are people that kind of stake out hospital emergency rooms and literally sign clients up as they come into the emergency room, say, hey, look, you were injured in a car accident. Sign here. We'll work out the details later, but we represent you and we'll pursue your liability claim. And it's something that happens. It's something that is unfortunate. It's highly unethical. It should be illegal. There should be criminal consequences for it, but it still happens. And people fall prey to it because of the fact that they are in a difficult, stressful situation and they need to have that issue fixed so they can focus on the physical recovery. So it's always critical to talk to an attorney to know your rights first, but make sure you get a good referral or you are able to verify who it is you're speaking with before you sign any type of paperwork. Similarly, on the insurance side of things, what happens also shortly thereafter is an insurance company will call that person and seek to take a statement and seek to record that statement. And the insurance companies, when they're doing that, even if they're saying they're going to do the right thing, they're going to accept that liability was on the part of their insured, they're going to do everything they can and use whatever information they can gather, oftentimes directly from the injured patient, to undermine the value of that claim. And so it's important to talk with an attorney beforehand, before you talk with any insurance company, so that attorney can advise you as to what your rights are and what you should pursue, what you should do from a planning standpoint, because no one ever plans to get into a car accident. A lot of people don't realize that there's a certain thing that you can do to protect yourself, because most people that are on the roadways are probably getting a baseline level of insurance to just get their car registered. So if you just need to get your car street legal, you're going to pay for a $25,000 liability policy. Well, if you get hit by a car in a car accident, and let's say you're taken to the hospital and you had to have emergency surgery on your tibia, and you spend 3 or 4 days in the hospital, and you've got $150,000 in medical bills from ambulance treatment and other hospitalization expenses, the only liability coverage you could pursue would be the $25,000 policy of that person that hit you. Well, that's not going to compensate you fully for your injuries or for your losses. And so probably the biggest protector that most people don't realize is something called uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. And that's something that is part of your general car policy. And most people don't understand or realize how that works. But what uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage provides you is an extra layer of coverage to protect you from those people that don't have sufficient insurance. And it varies from state to state. In the states where I practice, Georgia and Illinois and Tennessee and Florida, but primarily Georgia and Illinois, the insurance laws vary in terms of what type of coverage you can have and how that coverage would apply. But the important thing is most people on the roadways don't have a lot of insurance to begin with. So if you happen to get hit, the odds are you're going to need to have certain layers of protection that you plan for. And that's in the form of uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. And it doesn't cost that much more in your monthly premium. But what's gone on with all the big box carriers of insurance, Progressive and State Farm and Geico, people just want to get insurance coverage, and they're not doing a thorough job of researching what that actually means. It's always important to be able to talk with someone, as opposed to just ticking a box on a website to purchase your insurance coverage. So it's always important to be able to talk with a person so they can explain to you what those various coverages are. And I have conversations with clients all the time about, like, there's a point in the litigation where I sit them down and say, I'm going to scold you a little bit, but you have the bare minimum uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage, and this is actually going to limit or restrict your ability to make a full recovery in your case. And then I say, hey, look, send me your your declarations page for your insurance, and I can tell you where your policy limit should be. And then I tell them to go and call their insurance agent and make those changes immediately. So in the event something else happens down the road, they'll have additional protection from the unknown.
That's very good information. Is there any audit process around that? It sounds like 25,000 is like not nearly enough these days.
It's definitely not, but that's all governed by state statute. So
every state has a different minimum?
Every state has different minimum requirements, and usually it's a minimum policy of insurance that you have to get to show you have what's general liability coverage, and you have to have that in order to be able to get your car registered, to be able to get your tag renewed. And so, and when people have the minimum level of insurance, and those are probably the ones that are the most at-risk drivers, because they're usually the ones driving around in a beat-up 88 Nissan Pathfinder or whatever, some old dated car that's all banged up, and they're just getting the minimum coverage because the vehicle's not worth that much, and they just need to be able to get it because it's their own mode of transportation. And they're probably the ones that are going to put you most at risk because they don't have much to lose.
Got it. So is there like I don't know, some kind of process? So it sounds like it's state driven. So every state can have different levels, but
it is state driven, and the insurance laws are different. But again, it's just the bare minimum that's required by state law in order to be able to get your car registered. You have to have a minimum policy of liability insurance coverage on your vehicle. And it's basically left up to the individual to take additional steps to protect them beyond what the bare minimums are.
It sounds like
most people.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, it sounds like there should be some major reform around that, because if you leave it to the individual, I mean, most are going to choose the cheapest option.
Well, I would say most people that don't have that are essentially living hand to mouth, that don't have the means to pay for good coverage, and even if you have bare minimum coverage, it's still the devil's in the details of what the policy is. So right. You could be, I mean, and I see it all the time where you pay a premium thinking you've got certain amounts of coverage, but then because you didn't read the policy book in detail, there could be certain exclusions that prevent you from being able to use your medical payments coverage, which you paid for, or your uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage, which is a contractual benefit that you pay for when you purchase that additional layer of coverage under your policy. The devil is always in the details. And so you'll have some substandard carriers that will issue policies of insurance and give you the expectation that you've got certain layers of coverage that might give you confidence, but unless a person goes and actually reads that policy, they don't know the coverage they've got, and they may not have the coverage that they think they paid for.
And they might not be the best one to go through it themselves. They should probably get help, at least maybe annually, from an insurance agent.
Correct.
Or somebody like yourself that, or, to go through that and pick it apart together to make sure that the individual understands their risks for the choices.
Exactly. And I mean, as you were talking about with people should always get a will, the thing that is very important, if you have the ability and the means to plan for it, a lot of people have financial planners. Financial planners will consult with wills and estates attorneys. Financial planners will also consult with insurance agents to determine if you have appropriate levels of business insurance coverage, malpractice insurance coverage, an umbrella policy on your home for excess liability. Those are all things that if you put a plan in place, they can help you tick all those boxes. But I think the thing that's most critical with all of that is the need for personal relationships where you can get on the phone with someone and talk with them who you got a question. And that's one thing that I do with my clients. The thing I can't do with my clients is I can't roll the clock back to the day before they needed me. I can only try to be proactive and go forward and help them get a resolution or recovery in their case, but also help guide them with direction on if they need to get a wills and estates attorney, or God forbid they need to go through a divorce. I can refer them to a divorce attorney. But the key is always to have good personal relationships. And that's one of the things that's been great about how you and I met, is just the broad network that our business network has allowed us to be able to meet people across the country, and make those relationships and get to know people on a more personal level, so you know what it is that they exactly do, and you can refer them on to someone that you might cross paths with in another sector to be able to get them help that they need.
Absolutely. Be that connector for sure.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like the top 2 tips are: have your phone number in their glove box if they're in one of the states that you practice in.
Yes.
Ideally call you first, but yeah, definitely at a minimum, almost make like a little checklist, or if you have one that you can share, that'd be awesome. But almost like if you're in an accident, these are the top 3 things that you need to do right now. And the second one you mentioned was basically make sure your insurance is in adequate condition and in order. So I would recommend at least annually audit your insurance and go through that with a licensed professional to make sure that you understand what you're signing up for. Because let's be real. I mean, obviously, most people want to just do the minimum, and because it's cheaper, right? Save money. Everybody wants to save money. But you might not understand the risks associated with that cost savings. And like you said, there's a lot of movement to online platforms, but this is, in my opinion, more of a reason to have that personable relationship with an insurance agent and somebody like yourself, so you can pick up that phone and you can ask these questions.
Right. No, the insurance, I mean, most people aren't going to be, if you want to have a surefire way to fall asleep at night, read the details of an insurance policy. That'll put you to sleep after like the first page. So getting into the details of what your coverage is and the possible exclusions that are there, you need to have someone in a professional setting explain that to you and help guide you through that, so you can make informed decisions on it. But the 3 bullet points I would send away, or send your audience away with, is if you're ever in a wreck and you're in the hospital, do not sign up with an attorney in the hospital. Do not talk with the insurance company or anyone from an insurance company until you talk with a lawyer. And if you're in the states of Georgia, Illinois, Tennessee, or Florida, and you're in a wreck, call me. My cell number is 678-592-8743.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sean. This has been fantastic. One thing that came to mind when you were saying that the top 3 tips is, I was looking at cyber insurance for a client of mine. And on the cyber insurance side of things, some vendors will require certain cyber requirements in order to do business with them. And we call, sometimes they're given a questionnaire. We call those questionnaires like a vendor security questionnaire, or VSQ. And there might be certain coverage limits or requirements on there. But one thing that I learned in interviewing a cybersecurity professional is that if your annual revenue, so say the VSQ requires 5 million in coverage, but your annual revenue is only 1, you can't get 5 million in coverage. I didn't realize that was, so you basically, you can only get covered. You can get a little bit more than $1 million. So if your revenue is $1 million, you might be able to get $1.5 million or 2 million if you combine like an umbrella with things together. Mm-hmm. But you're not going to get to 5 million if your revenues aren't there yet. So I thought that was very interesting to hear. So I'm just wondering if that kind of concept correlates to the individual level. If your net worth is X, maybe you only can get this certain amount of coverage for maximums on the other end of the spectrum, not the cheapest coverage, right, but what's the best that I can get too.
Well, I think with on the consumer level, with regards to just general premises insurance, like your typical homeowners insurance or your auto insurance, they have certain levels that are in place, and it gets to a point where it may become, you want to protect what you can possibly lose. And that's the thing that I think from a casualty or hazard standpoint, you don't want to over-insure yourself, but you want to protect yourself, and from a liability side of things, you want to be able to protect yourselves for what you could possibly lose. Let's say if you look down to grab your cell phone and you hit a kid on a bicycle or something, or you have some unfortunate incident where you possibly could be at fault and you could be suspect or subject to a possible judgment. You want to make sure you've got good, sufficient levels of insurance in place. And so those are, I think that's the difference between the insurance you're talking about with regard to the earnings that they might have over a year, and being able to have comparable coverage and not be able to get coverage at a certain level because their earnings aren't as much. On the liability side of things, you're seeking to protect what you already have or what you could possibly lose in the event you're at fault for something.
Right. One thing that came to mind when you're talking about that is, what about dash cams or dash cam technologies? Do you recommend those? Is that a good thing to have?
I would recommend those in the sense that they are great capturers of information. Right. They can possibly be distracting, and you could also, a picture is always worth 1,000 words. And I have had the good fortune lately of getting a lot of surveillance footage that shows exactly how my client was injured and how my client was not at fault at all and what had happened. And there's a lot of legal channels you got to go through in order to get that, especially when I had a guy who got hit by a car in a mall parking lot. And because I hadn't filed suit yet, the risk manager of the mall said, "We're not going to respond to any document requests until you provide a subpoena." Well, I can't issue a subpoena until there's a formal court case. And the goal of mine a lot of times is to resolve my cases for my clients without having to resort to litigation. And it would actually give my clients a better ability to argue their case pre-suit if they would provide that information. Right. But I had to work with what I was given in a pre-suit capacity, and we turned up having to file suit. So I ended up getting the surveillance footage. But dash cam videos, you've seen, they've kind of come on in the United States a lot, like just recently. But if you just watch random videos on Twitter or on the internet, like everyone in Europe has them. Everyone in Russia seems to have them, and they're always on, and they're great. They're great ways to keep information and gather information and be able to provide your best case. They could also show that you might have been at fault. Right.
Providing factual evidence. Absolutely.
Right. The camera's going to capture everything, good and or bad, for you. And I've had, thankfully, good fortune in the times where I've had good surveillance footage of cases. They've all seemed to cut my way. But that's another thing that I would recommend, just because it's another way to protect yourself.
Absolutely. Well, great information, and thank you so much. I appreciate it very much, and thanks for joining.
No, I really enjoyed it, Craig. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm going to stop.
Thanks for listening to yet another episode of Cybersecurity and Compliance with Craig Petronella. Listen to all of our podcasts on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Visit us online at petronellatech.com to book a meeting with Craig about your business.